Get any errors, but we did get this output from SQL Alchemy. Don't worry about pass that same query again, but I'm going to capture it in a very. This is convenient because the post, but we're using a lowercase U for the user ID in the post model. And that is because in the user model, we're referencing the actual post class. And in the foreign key, we're actually referencing the table name and the column name. So it's lowercase. So the user model automatically has this table name set to lowercase user, and the post model will have a table name automatically set to lowercase post. Now, if you want to set your own table names, then you can set a specific table name attribute. Post model will have a table name automatically set to lowercase post. Now, if you want to set your own table names, then you can set a specific table name attribute, but since our models are pretty simple, we'll just leave those as the default lowercase values. Oh, and one mistake that I see here that I made, you probably noticed this when I did it, but whenever I created this email, this is supposed to be email here, and I actually left that as username. So that should have been email, so sorry about that. Okay, so now that we have these database models that represent the structure of our database, we can now use those to create the database. So to do this, we're going to use the command line. So I'm going to open up my terminal here, and I've still got my virtual environment activated and am navigated to the project directory. So within here, I'm going to say Python, and you have to be within your project directory to get these imports to work. So now I'm going to say from Flask blog import DB. So Flask blog is my application file, and DB is the instance of our database that we created. So I'll import that. Now, we didn't get any errors, but we did get this output from SQL Alchemy. Don't worry about that. It's just some information. So now we can actually create our database by saying db.create_all and use that create all method. So if I hit enter, you can see that we don't get any errors. So that should have created our database. Now, since we're using a SQLite database for now, this is actually going to be a file on our file system, and we set our database URI to be a file in the same directory as our application and called that site.db. So if we look at our project directory, then we can see that now we have a site.db file here in our project directory. Now, I know that might be a little hard for you to see in my sidebar, but I have a Finder window open here with my project, and we can see that we have a site.db file here that was created. Okay, so now we have that database, but it's currently empty. Now, it's also easy to add data to our database using the command line. Now, we'll be using our application to add this data later, but let's go ahead and add a user and a post just so we can see how this works. So I will go back to the command line, and now I want to import those models. So I'll say from Flask blog import, and the name of our models was user and post. So let's import those. And now let's create an instance of our user. So I'm just going to call this user user1, and I will set this equal to our user class. And now I'm going to pass in all of the attributes that this needs. So it needs a username, so I'll just set that equal to Corey. And also I'll pass in an email. So for an email, I'll just say c@demo.com. And it also needs a password. So we'll say set a password equal to password for now. So we're setting a plain text password for this example, but we're going to be hashing these passwords when we do this through our application. Also notice that we didn't specify an ID or an image file for this user. So since the ID is our primary key, it will assign this user a unique ID automatically. And we have a default value for our image file. If you remember, if we don't provide that, then it will just get that value of default.jpg that we specified in our model. So now let's tell our database that we're going to want to add this user. So to add this user, we can just do a db.session.add, and we want to add that user1 that we just created. Okay, so now we have that database, but it's currently empty. Now, it's also get that value of default.jpg that we specified in our model. So now let's tell our database that we're going to want to add this user. So to add this user, we can just do a db user1, and I will set this equal to our user. user class. And now I'm going to pass in all of the attributes that this needs. So it needs a username. So I'll just set that equal to Corey. And also I'll pass in an email. So for an email, I'll just say c@demo.com. And it also needs a password. So we'll say set a password equal to password for now. So we're setting a plain text password for this example, but we're going to be hashing these passwords when we do this through our application. Also notice that we didn't specify an ID or an image file for this user. So since the ID is our primary key, it will assign this user a unique ID automatically. And we have a default value for our image file. If you remember, if we don't provide that, then it will just get that value of default.jpg that we specified in our model. So now let's tell our database that we're going to want to add this user. So to add this user, we can just do a db.session.add, and we want to add that user one that we just created. So if we run that, we can see we don't get any errors. Now that hasn't actually added the user to our database. We've just told it that we have a change that we want to make to our database. So we could have several changes at a time and add them like this. And then when we commit those changes, then it will make all those changes to the database at once. So for example, if I add another user here, so I'm going to call this user 2, and I will set the username equal to John Doe and set the email to jd@demo.com, and we'll keep the password set to password. And now if I also add this user, so I'll add user 2, now let's commit those changes to actually commit those to the database. So we can say db.session.commit. And now that those are committed, they should now actually be in the database. And SQL Alchemy makes querying the database extremely easy. So let's look at a couple of common queries. So if we want to just get all of the users, then we can simply say, I'm going to clear my screen here, then we can simply say user.query. .all to get all of our users. And we can see here that it returns a list of both users that were created. So here is our first and here is our second. Now, if we just wanted to get the first user, then we could access it from the list that was just returned, or we could use the first method that gives you the very first result. So I could say user.query.first, and if I run that, you can see that we just get that first user back. Now, we can also filter the results by using the filter by method. So if we wanted to filter by usernames, then we could say, so user.query and use this filter by method. And we could say that we want to filter by users who have a username equal to Corey. And then we can do a .all to return all of those results. And we can see that we just get a list of one user there with that matching username. Now, if there were multiple people with that same username, then that would return a list of all those, but that should never happen in our application since our username is unique. And we can use the first method here as well. So if we just grab that first result without it being in the list, then we can just do a .first there, and we can see that we just get that user with no list. Okay, so now let's look at this user that is getting returned. So I'm going to use that same query again, but I'm going to capture it in a variable. So I will say user is equal to user.query filter by username equals Corey.first. So if I hit enter, now our user is that user that was returned from that query. But now we should have access to some additional attributes. So I could say user.id, and we can see that that user has an ID of 1. Now we can actually perform queries using the ID as well. So we already saw user.query.all and user.query.first, but if we were to say user is equal to user.query.get, then this will fetch a user with a specific ID. So if I get a user with the ID of 1, which should be that same user, then we can see that we get that same user as a result. So now let's look at this user's post by saying user.post. And we can see that that returns an empty list because this user doesn't have any posts at the moment. Now remember what I said when we wrote our model. So let me bring this up just so we can see it here. So when we wrote the model, I said that the post attribute isn't actually a column itself. That is actually running an additional query on the post table that grabs any post from that user. So let's create some posts written by this user so that we can see the model. I said that the post attribute isn't actually a column itself. That is actually running an additional query on the post table that grabs any post from that user. So let's create some posts written by this user so that we can see what this looks like. So I'm going to go back to our command line. Now I'm going to clear our screen here again so that we have more room. Now we still have access to that user. So I still have that first user with a user ID of 1. So now let's create a post. So I'll say post_1 is equal to post. And now we need to pass in all of the values that a post needs. So it needs a title. So I can just do a title of blog 1. It also needs some content. So I'll set the content equal to first post content with an exclamation point. And then it needs an author. And the author is a user ID. So I'll say user ID is equal to our current user.id. So let's run that. And also notice that when we created this post, we didn't specify a date for this post. So if we remember from our model, we have a default date of UTC UTC now. So it should populate the date with the current UTC time if we didn't provide anything, which we didn't. Okay, so now let's add one more post that is similar. So I will go up here and change the variable name. I'll change this to post2, and we will set the title equal to blog2, the content equal to second post content, and we will keep the user ID the same. Okay, now remember, we've created these posts, but they're not added to our database yet. To add them to the database, we need to do a db session.add, and we can add post1 and also add post2, and then we can do a db session commit to commit both of those at the same time. Okay, so now that those posts are committed to the database, now let's look at this user's post again. So I'll say user.posts, and we can see that now this user has a list of 2 blog posts, and this result is just a list, so we can loop through these just like any other list. So I could say for post in user.post, and within this list, I will print out, or within this loop, I will print out the post.title. So if I run that, then you can see it loops through our user post and prints out both of the titles for that. Okay, so now let me get the first of these posts by actually querying the post table directly. So I'll say post is equal to post.query.first, like we've seen before. And if I look at that, then we can see that we got the first post. Then now we can get the ID of the user who created this post just by accessing that column. So I could do a post.user ID, and we can see that that user ID is equal to 1. So we got the right ID for the user who created this post, but in the post table, that's the only information about the user that we have. We might want more information about that author. Now, if we remember back to our model, if I open this up here, then the post relationship from our user model lets us not only access that user's post, but it also adds this backref of author to each post. And that's not an actual column down here in our post model, but it allows us to use that to access the user who created the post. So if I switch back here to the command line, then we can see what that backref does. So if I was to say post.author, which again isn't in our post model, but if I was to run that, then we can see that we get the entire user object that we can work with. So that's an extremely nice feature with SQL Alchemy. Okay, so now that we've added some sample data just to make sure that everything was working properly, now let's delete all of this data so that in the next video, we're starting from scratch with a nice new clean database. So this is easy to do, just like we did with db.createAll before. This time we can simply say, and let me clear the screen here, we can simply say db.dropAll, and that drops all of our database tables and rows. So now to create those tables fresh one more time, then we can just create them again. So I'll say db.create_all and run that, and that should have recreated that database structure. And now if we query all of our users or posts, so I'll say user.query.all, then we can see that that returns an empty list, so that's good. And if we do the same for posts, so post.query.all, then we can see that that is an empty list too, so those are both empty. Okay, so I think that is going to do it for this video. We now have our database created and a way to add data to that database, and in the next video, we'll be restructuring our application to a package so that we can move these models into their own file and also learn about the other benefits of using packages as an application structure. But if anyone has any questions about what we covered in this video, then feel free to ask in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer those. And if you enjoy these tutorials and would like to support them, then there are several ways you can do that. The easiest way is to simply like the video and give it a thumbs up, and also it's a huge help to share these videos with anyone who you think would find them useful. And if you have the means, you can contribute through Patreon, and there's a link to that page in the description section below. Be sure to subscribe for future videos, and thank you all for watching. Hey there, how's it going, everybody? In this video, we'll be restructuring our application to be a package rather than running it as a module. Now, I usually start off all my Flask applications as packages because you dodge a lot of headaches by creating it as a package from the beginning, but I see a lot of people using modules like we've done so far, so I wanted to show you the process of converting these into using a package and also the reasons why you'd want to do that. Now, if you remember in the last video, I said that I would be putting our database models into our main application rather than splitting them into a different file like we did with our forms, and that's because the imports can get a little weird. So let me actually split these models into a different file so that we can see what happens and what the problem is. So I'll create a file here within my main project. And I'm going to call this models.py to hold our database models. And now let's move those models over to that models.py file. So I'm going to grab the user and the post models there, and I'm going to cut those out of our application and paste those in to our models.py file. And we can see that our classes use the model class from our DB instance, so we need to import DB as well. So let's grab that by saying from Flask blog, which is our application file, import DB. And our models also use the datetime library here. So let's move that import from Flask blog as well. So I'm going to go to Flask blog here and grab the datetime module. So I will cut that out and I will paste that into the top of our models here. So I will save that and save our Flask blog as well. And now within our Flask blog module, we're going to be using those models within our views. So we need to import those here as well. So we can import those just like we did with our forms by saying from models import, and we want to import user and post. Okay, so now let's run our application and see if everything worked. Now, since I mentioned that there was problems with this, we can probably take an educated guess that this isn't going to work, but let's go ahead and try it anyway. So if I pull up my terminal here and try to run this application just like we have been doing, I'll say python flaskblog.py and run that, and we can see we got an error. We got an import error, cannot import name user. And actually what's going on here is kind of a big mess. Now I'm going to walk through this, but if you don't quite understand it, then don't worry about it right now. The solution that we're going to put in place is going to be a lot more simple than what this walkthrough of this error is going to be. Okay, so this is called a circular import, but even this circular import is extra confusing. Now I knew that this would fail, but at first this was really confusing to me as to why this was failing on the user import and not somewhere else. So let's walk through this step by step and explain why it failed on the user import. So we're actually running our Flask blog script from the command line. And when we run that script, I'll pull this up, it imports the user and post from our models module. And anytime Python imports something from a module, it still runs that entire module. Now, some people aren't aware of that. They think that it only runs the section that is being imported. So when it runs the entire models module, then it comes into our models script here, and then it tries to perform its imports. So then it gets here to this line and says from Flask blog import DB. So at this point, this is where I would expect that this would fail, because we've already seen the Flask blog module. That's where we just came from. And I figured it would just say, hey, I've already seen this Flask blog module, and I haven't seen this DB variable that you're asking for. So if I switch over here to Flask blog, the reason it hasn't seen this DB variable yet is because it's created after our import statement. So it's down here. So then it would throw an error saying that it doesn't, that it can't import this DB variable, but it doesn't do that. It fails on the user import. So why does it do that? So what's actually going on here is that when we ran Flask blog from the command line, we're running it directly with Python. And so we're running this Flask blog script, which Python calls _main. And then we say from models import user and post. And then it comes in and runs our models script. And when it gets to this line here from Flask blog import DB, Python actually hasn't seen Flask blog yet because Python named Flask blog _main. So it will actually run our Flask blog module for a second time from the beginning. So it comes in here, and then it redoes all of these same imports, reruns this models import again. And when it gets to that models import, it says, okay, I've already seen this models module, but I don't know what this user class is. And the reason it doesn't know what this user class is because it is below our imports in the models module. So that is why it fails on the user import and not on the DB import. Now, I know that this is confusing, but just keep bearing with me. So if I were to come into my models module here, and I was to change this Flask blog import instead to _main and save that, then this should still give us an error, but it should give us the error that I initially expected, saying that it can't find the DB variable instead of failing on the user. So if I go back to the command line and clear out that output and then try to rerun on the user. So if I go back to the command line and clear out that output and then try to rerun this application again, then we can see that we still do get an import error, but it's saying that it cannot import name DB. And just to walk through this one more time, the reason that it fails on this import now is because when we come in here to our Flask blog module, it runs this and it gets down and runs our models import. And when we come into our models, now we're running this import here from main import DB. And it's already seen this main module, but it hasn't created this DB variable yet, so that's why it fails on that import. Now, we could fix this by moving our models import here down below the creation of our DB variable. So if I move that below there and save this, and then rerun our application from the command line, so I'll clear out that and run that, then we can see that this seems to be running. And if I pull up the website here and rerun this or reload it, then we can see that it is running now. So even though our application is running now, the way that we actually solve this problem is still really ugly. And if we were to run our application where Flask blog wasn't set to _main, then all of this would fail. So for example, when we created our database in the last video by doing db.createAll in the command line, that will no longer work. So let me show you this by actually deleting our current site.db file. And I'm just going to delete it here from my sidebar. And now we'll try to recreate this from the command line. So to try to create this, I will stop the running server with Control-C and clear that out. And I'll start up Python, just like we did in the last video. We can say from Flask blog, import db. Then we can see that at this point that this fails. And that's because it's looking for db in one of our imports in _main. And at that point, _main is no longer our Flask blog module. So I know that all of that was confusing, but if you don't understand it, then it's no big deal. The solution that we're going to go over is a lot easier than going through the problem itself. I just wanted to justify why we were structuring this project into packages, which is going to fix this. Now, just to give credit where credit is due, I first saw a good explanation of this in a talk that Miguel Greenberg gave in a 2016 PyCon talk called Flask at Scale, and that is where I first saw a good explanation of these import issues. Okay, so the solution here is to set up our code in a way to where we're not running Flask blog directly. That way, it won't get that name of _main. So the way we're going to do this is to turn our application into a package, and using a package will make all of these imports more simple and allow us to separate things out better than we've done now. So in order to tell Python that your directory is a package, you just need to create a _init file. So let's create a package with the name of our application. So I'm going to exit out of Python here, and now I'm going to pull back up our project in our editor. And within our project, I'm going to create a new folder with the same name as our application. So I'm going to create a new folder here, and I'm going to call this Flask blog, all lowercase. And within this folder, we'll create a _init.py file. So I will right click on here and say new file, and this is _init_.py. And again, I know that the text is a little small to see over here in the sidebar, but I'll show a larger version of this structure here in a second. Okay, so now we have a new package with the name of our application. So now let's move some of our current project into this new package. So I'm going to open this in Finder, and if you're working on Windows, then you can do this in Explorer. So now let's move everything from our application so far into this package, except for the module named Flask blog. Let's leave that where it is. So the forms and models and static folder and template folder, we're going to move all of these into the Flask blog package. So I will grab all of those and move those into our Flask blog package. Now, this PyCache, don't worry about that. It's just something that gets created. We can actually just delete that for now. Okay, so now in our project directory, we can see that we have this Flask blog package and this Flask blog module. So now I'm going to go back to Sublime Text, and I'm going to close everything down here for now. Okay, now we want to open up that _init.py file. So our init file in our package will be where we initialize our application and bring together different components. So I'm going to have our previous Flask blog module open here, and we can separate out certain parts. So I'm going to open up our previous application module, and now I'm going to grab all of the imports and the parts where we are creating our application. So I'm going to have our previous Flask blog module open here, and we can separate out certain parts. So I'm going to open up our previous application module, and now I'm going to grab all of the imports and the parts where we are creating our application. So I'm going to copy from our imports all the way down to the creating the instance of our database. So I will cut those out and paste those into the init.py file. And now in our old application module, now we're left with a lot of route information. So let's actually separate out our routes into their own module so that everything has its own place. So I'll create a new file within our package called routes.py. So create a new file, call this routes.py. And now let's grab all of that route information and paste it into routes. And I'm going to grab the dummy data and the models import as well. So I will copy all of this route information. I'm basically going to copy everything except where we're running our application. So we don't want the if name is equal to main conditional. So I will cut out all of that, clean this up a bit, and paste that into routes. Okay, so now all we're left with in our original application file is what we were using to run to routes. Okay, so now all we're left with in our original application file is what we were using to run the application. So let's leave this here, and when we want to test what we've got, we'll still be running this file. That's only job is to grab the app and run it. So first of all, since running the application is the only purpose of this file now, let's rename this to run.py so that that's clear. So I'm going to come over here and right-click on this file and rename this, and I'm going to rename this to run.py. That way we don't confuse the name of that module with our new package that is now named Flask blog. Okay, so we're still running app.run within this file. So we need to import the app to run from our package. And to do that, we can simply say from Flask blog import app. And when you're working with packages, that is going to import from the init.py file within that package. So that that app variable has to exist within init.py, and it does. You can see that we're creating it here, so it will have that. Okay, and lastly, we need to go through our other files and clean up our imports. So some of the imports within this init.py file were only used in our routes, so we still need to import Flask here, but render template and URL4 and all of those were only used in our routes. So let's move those there. So I'm going to copy this entire line and paste those into the routes, and we don't need to copy this entire line and paste those into the routes. And we don't need this Flask object here. We only need render template, URL for, flash, and redirect. So now if we go back to the init.py file, then we can remove all of those imports except for Flask. So we'll keep that. Okay, so we still need this SQL Alchemy here since we use it for our app initialization down here on line 8. Now the forms we were also only using within our routes. So let's grab those and move those there. So I'm just going to cut those out and now paste these into our routes. And also now when we do these imports, instead of importing from models and forms like we did before, now that we're in a package, we are going to use the package name and then the module name. So it's going to be flaskblog.forms and flaskblog.modules. So let's save that. And also if we scroll down here a bit in our routes, then we can see that our decorators are using this app. So it uses the app to create these decorators. So we need to import that app variable into our routes also. So we can import that from our package. So just like we saw before, we can say from flaskblog import app. Now, if we go back to our app initialization, then we need to import our routes here also so that when we run our application, it can find those. Now, even though we fixed the problems with the messy imports, we still have to watch for circular imports. So remember that our routes are importing this app variable here. So we can't import the routes at the top of the file or else we'll get into one of those circular imports again. So instead, let's do the import of the routes after we've made the application initialization and put it down here at the bottom. So I'll say from flaskblog import routes and save that. Okay, so we're almost done here. So let's also check our forms and models modules as well. So let's open both of those up. So first let's check our forms. So in forms, we're not forms and models modules as well. So let's open both of those up. So first let's check our forms. So in forms, we're not using any other modules from our package. We're just using packages that we pip installed. So nothing needs to be changed there. So lastly, we'll check our modules or models. Okay, and here's where we had our messy workaround from before. Now, instead of importing from main, we can simply import from flaskblog because now we know that's not going to be called _main anymore. So we can just say from flaskblog import db, and that's going to come into the init.py file and import this db variable here. Okay, so that should do it. But before I run this, let me show you the tree structure of what we've done in this video so you can get a better idea of what this looks like. So I've installed a nice command line tool here called tree that allows me to print out this structure. Okay, so we can see that in our project directory, we now have this Flask blog package and a module called run.py that will run our application. Now within the Flask blog package, we have this _init.py file that tells Python that this is a package. And it also initializes and ties together everything that we need for our app. And we now have a routes file that contains all of the logic for those. And everything else should be familiar from our other videos, but we've just cleaned up the imports. So we have the forms and the models modules, and also we still have the static and the templates folders, and we didn't change anything